Hi everyone, I'm back again with a second episode as a part of the At Home With Me series. And as you can see, I'm quite at home. I am your host, Olaoluwa, aka Laulu, and this episode will be talking a bit about labels and the power of almost shaking off the labels too. So I want to start with a story, and specifically, this story is actually at one of the peaks of my career as a young adult. So in 2020, myself and Oyen had essentially applied for a tender for £250,000, and we did actually win that money to start running boot camps for Black women in the West Midlands. And we actually didn't know what we were doing. Well, we did somewhat, but there were loads of things that we would go back and never do again. And it was also the same year that George Floyd was killed. And it was also the same year that all of our favorites were passing away and dying. It was a bit of a weird year, as well as being in a pandemic, and not being close to family members and lots of other things. So 2020, we hit the ground running with this project that becomes a major business model for us currently. And we decided to run a boot camp for 50 women. And I'm in the process of just learning new skills, because up until that point, I was very much a CMO. So I was doing marketing, I was creating content. I think my strengths were more so creative direction and not necessarily like marketing strategy. I learned that the hard way. Um, and so we went through that journey, and then 2021, we started to receive a lot of awards and recognition for our work. And I remember specifically summer of 2021 feeling incredibly sad. Sad with myself, sad with how I was, and just um, not very settled or accepting of what was happening, which is weird, right? Because a lot of the time we assume when the spotlight is on us, that we should be happy and everything should be going well. But that was quite the opposite for me. Things were going really well, and I was not happy. I actually have video footage of myself like crying during work days. And bear in mind, we're still working entirely virtual, and I just wasn't happy with where I was. And I realized something. I heard someone say in that season that if the light on you is greater than the light in you, you're going to struggle. And I realized that what was happening was, although these really great things were happening, there was definitely a major part to play from like imposter syndrome and feeling like an imposter. Like, am I really doing good, or is this all just a fad? When people were telling me well done, I didn't know whether to be proud of myself or not. Um, which, when I think back, I kind of feel kind of sad thinking about that. But that's really where I was. And in that season, I learned a lot about the realities that were actually now coming to play. The reality was there were a lot of things, a lot of labels that I had believed about myself that were now a hindrance to actually enjoying the moment when these things were happening. And for many of us, especially if you are a creative, if you are, again, like business savvy, if you've got things going on and you're really looking for opportunities, a lot of us are very high functioning. and sometimes high functioning anxious people or high functioning depressed people. But a lot of us are very high functioning. We know how to power through despite something ongoing that could be very troubling to us. And I really discovered that about myself. Now, if you imagine the concentration of a light beam, underneath a light beam, it's very hot. And the reason why it's hot is because it's concentrated. And some light beams are so powerful that they can literally burn a hole in materials of different strength. And what was happening at that point in time is that I had the spotlight or a form of light beam on myself. And I couldn't hack it. I couldn't hack it internally because I didn't have the internal structure to help me navigate that journey. And so I was struggling. People were patting me on the back and saying well done and high-fiving me, and none of it landed. It would literally roll off my back like water, because it didn't resonate internally, because I didn't actually believe those things about myself. I believe quite the opposite. And sometimes what I've discovered is that we may not actively know that we have limiting beliefs or that we've believed certain labels, but what tends to happen is that, you know, you hear things about yourself or people say things to you, or it's just a passing thought that you just capture and you think and you agree with it, but then you never confront it. You never do the work of like uprooting that from your consciousness. And so what happens is that, kind of like dandelions, right? The wind blows, the seeds plant, and it becomes a weed in a very pretty garden. And everybody knows that weeds aren't actually cute. They look very kind of ugly. And that's what I was discovering. These were beliefs, labels, thought patterns that I didn't know were there, but were coming to the surface now that there was a level of visibility. And this tends to happen for everyone. I think everybody in their life, on their becoming journey, will have key moments that show you who you are. And if you're a believer, then you know that story very well, the story of Job, where he goes through all this stuff, and actually the entire journey, he is losing family, he's lost all his wealth, he's ill, close to death, and you know, he's asking God all these questions like, why is all this stuff happening to me? And he discovers that a lot of the things that he believed were not actually true. The reason why he was living the way he wasn't necessarily out of awe and reverence for God, but rather it was his fear that was driving all of his righteousness. And he says it himself. He said, the things that I have feared have come to my front door. They've literally started happening. So for me, in that point in time, I realized that there were a lot of labels, belief systems that I hadn't addressed. I didn't even know they were present. And then there was a defining moment. There was a key moment that was showing me, oh, okay, why aren't you happy? Because you don't believe these things. And it was causing a level of distance between the person that I was presenting and the person that I actually was. And anytime that's happening, it's really important to actually have a check-in, either with a therapist or with your accountability, your community, your friends, people that know and love you well, that can kind of reason with you on what is going on internally. Because I had those opportunities, but I was just silent. I was, I think I was borderline depressed, to be honest. I was waking up and crying because I didn't know what was going on. But what was happening under the surface was that I didn't believe that I was worthy of achieving something. And because at that time I was a co-founder, I also was in this weird kind of comparison of myself up against other business women, up against my co-founder at the time, Oyin. And I just felt like everybody else was doing much better at being themselves than I was, because I was labeled that I didn't know who I was. There were a lot of times in my journey where people told me, yeah, you don't know what you're doing and you don't know who you are. Or there were a lot of labels or things that I started to internalize that were not true, e.g. worthiness. And so how did I get out of there? A good therapist and some prayer. I got out of there, or I don't think I realized I came out of that space until I was willing to confront the absence of truth that I had present internally. So there were lots of things that I knew. There were lots of things that I could even argue were not true about myself, but I didn't actually accept those things. And a lot of the time, we don't come to understand that the fact that these thoughts that just float around our minds can actually implant themselves in our subconscious, and everything that we do that is not intentional comes from the subconscious. And so any kind of thought pattern or way of or belief system that we have will essentially help us to function when we are not intentionally doing something. I don't know if I explained that right, but technically what I'm trying to say is that the subconscious is very powerful. And then when we don't keep guard over the things that we believe or choose not to accept, we will begin to operate from that place, from the belief systems that we have unconsciously been programmed with. Labels are so potent in today's world. The world is very loud with labels, with what we should call ourselves, with what we shouldn't call ourselves, him, she, her, all of these things. And on one side of things, they are really important because a label or a title helps us understand how to approach something, or how to address a person, or how to define something. But at the same time, it could become really negative, because if a table has the wrong label on it, we're going to spend so much time mistreating and abusing the table when it's been labeled chair. So people are going to try and sit on the table. People are going to try and cross their legs on the table, and the table was not designed to do that. I think Einstein even said it in one weird way. He says, if we spend time trying to get fish to climb trees, then that fish will spend its entire life thinking that it's stupid. And I think that is the summary of everything I was going through in that 2020 to 2021 period, because I think that I was a fish that felt like I needed to climb a tree. And in order to climb the tree, I needed to be a certain type of way that I was not. And actually, just to go a bit deeper there, I think especially in the business space, there is a perception specifically about women and how business women ought to be. And some of those things are true. You know, any business person, any entrepreneurial person needs to be dogged and visionary and driven by that. But some of us kind of get caught up in, you know, maybe, for example, how we speak, or needing to pander to certain people within our industries and behave in a certain type of way, and actually we don't. And one of the things that I found is that I am probably more agreeable in nature. I come across as maybe a little softer. And so I found many occasions where people felt like they can do and say things because I had that nature, not knowing that, I appear like a kitten, but I'm actually a lion. Um, and so this was quite challenging because obviously defining it's a defining time in my career. There's lots of success and wins happening, but at the same time I'm having to truly decide whether I'm gonna um, be in agreement with these labels and these ideas that I had of myself, or if I'm gonna just chuck some of them out because they need to be in the bin. And I'm glad I decided to bin some of them. It's really important that when you're reflecting on how at home you are with yourself, that you kind of have a spectrum or a barometer that helps you gauge where you're at. It's really easy to go a long amount of time without necessarily checking in with yourself, knowing how you truly are and how you feel about certain things that are happening. And what that does is it will rob you. Because in the moments where you should be celebrating or happy, or in the moments where you should be mourning and sad, you are doing the opposite because you are disconnected from yourself and you're running away from what you should actually be dealing with. And I think that's why I spent a lot of time feeling sad or recording myself crying. um, I'll show you the footage one day. I really will. Uh, but at the bottom of all of that, if we're not taking time to actually be self-aware enough to check in with ourselves, then there'll be a lot of things that go unchecked. And I actually think that this is one of the reasons that, men continually have high levels of high suicide rates amongst men, because oftentimes they're just society encourages them to function and build and make money and secure the bag, and there isn't much of being in touch with actually where they are in themselves on their journey, how they feel about these things, and even just simple things like taking a break, or doing things that prioritize them. And I guess it's because society to a certain degree does not value those things when men do them, and so men don't feel like they have space to do those things. But that's a completely separate topic. The key lesson here is really being able to touch base with the things that you believe about yourself before you get to a point or come to a moment where something needs to be in place and it's not, and actually it's sabotaging that moment for you. And for some of you, that might be in relationships. For some of you, that might be in your career. For some of you, that could be making decisions in your favor. But if we don't believe certain things, or if we don't believe our worthiness, if we don't believe that we deserve certain things, if we agree with the fact that we are imposters of our own selves, then it's problematic. A lot of the time, what's interesting about imposter syndrome is that the voice never really goes away. It just gets quieter. And I think some people are waiting to not feel like imposters, waiting to not feel, or waiting to feel like they deserve it. But sometimes you have to do, and your action will show you or tell you or communicate to your brain and your internal narrative that actually this is where I ought to be. And I spend a lot of time talking to women who are given some of the best opportunities in the world to, move to different countries, start jobs in various technical fields. And I've heard people legit tell me, I'm not ready. I don't want to do that because of this, or I don't feel like I know enough yet. And I'm just like, screw that. And I can say that because I've been there, and I know that this is literally your mind, your fears, your insecurities trying to talk you out of an opportunity that will teach you so much more about who you are and what you're capable of. So the secret really to unlearning these narratives, to adopting new labels and rejecting the rest of them, the ones that aren't so great, is really just being willing to forcefully advance ourselves, being able to see the truth and align with new truths, knowing that the seeds that were planted in your origins, some of them need to be uprooted, but others need nurturing, and they need an opportunity to grow. And a good example is this, right? So I spent a lot of time being told to shut up and to stop talking when I was younger. Luckily, that didn't actually shut me up entirely, but I think I became more conscious of speaking because I somehow learned that I wasn't making. Oh, I learned this narrative that I wasn't making sense to people, and it was so interesting because people would always tell me, "Laulu, you speak so well," or like, "You're really articulate," and I would be like, huh? And it didn't resonate because I had this internal belief that actually you don't make sense. I had told myself I didn't make sense because people didn't want to hear me. So people didn't want to hear me because you must not be making sense. But people just didn't want to hear me because I was probably just a loud, chatty child that I did need to be quiet sometimes. But I had to unlearn that narrative that I didn't make sense because it wasn't true. Because I speak to you guys, I speak to so many people, and they completely get where I'm coming from. So it was really a lie that I had told myself. And I had to spend time understanding where that came from. I even started a speaking program with Coach Rob Klutze, and he's an amazing guy, actually. Guys, check him out if you know that you definitely have something in your life and you feel like you're supposed to be a speaker at some point, or an orator, or some kind of voice in the world. Please make sure you go and on board onto his program. It's amazing. One of the best things you'll do for yourself. But something we did in one of my first sessions with him is literally unpack some of the beliefs that I had told myself about speaking, because these things were a direct wall to me actually being vulnerable and being available to the people that I'm actually called to. I say all of that to come back to this point. It's really important that we find whatever it is, whatever the lie is, we need to be able to link it back to where it's coming from. So I spoke in the last episode about the origin story. I connected it to being told that I was this chatty child that people didn't want to hear. Okay, cool. What did I teach myself because of those experiences? Because of my origins, I told myself that I must not have been making sense. However, the reality was that people found me very articulate and very able to communicate things that should be hard or challenging. Okay, great. So I now had to do the work of forcefully moving, making sure that when I felt like I didn't want to speak or didn't want to take advantage of a speaking opportunity, that I was rooting out that lie that I had told myself. Like, the reason I didn't do a speaking opportunity better not be that I'm not going to make sense, because we know that that's a lie. We know that that's not true. And so I had to forcefully advance myself against the things that were almost like intrusions to my productivity as a person. I am so glad that I've had the opportunity to experience these things and almost break up with some of these labels. And my hope is that you too, that you would go on that journey of like divorcing the negative labels and accepting the good ones. Because some of us, our problem isn't necessarily the negative labels, it's the fact that the good stuff doesn't land and we don't let it touch our hearts for whatever reason. Maybe because that is our armor protecting us from being hurt, or not believing the best about ourselves, or not believing that people, when they say things to you, are actually saying it from a positive perspective and not because they're trying to deceive you or anything like that. So my hope is that you will make alliance with the positive labels and divorce the negatives. And I will see you in the next episode.